Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today, we'll be looking at the work of an apologist you may be familiar with, one Frank Turek. Most of his videos are pretty short, so I picked a few that looked interesting to me. The first one that caught my interest is one question you should always ask an unbeliever, so I guess it's for me. As per usual, please click on the link if you want to watch his full video.
What's the one question you should ask somebody who is not a believer? I think it's this. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
My answer would depend on which version of Christianity the truth actually is. For brevity, I'll mention the extremes. If the God that really exists is a being who cares about loving thy neighbor and turning the other cheek, and will reward those who live a good life with an eternal reward, then I think I would fit in quite well as a Christian. But if God is really someone who commands us to take our slaves from the heathens around us and will judge us on our beliefs, so that many kind and good unbelievers will receive an eternal punishment, then I want no part in its creation.
If the person hesitates at all, the problem isn't just intellectual, it's also volitional. They might not want it to be true.
Or, again, there are thousands of denominations, many of them mutually exclusive. The person may be hesitating because they don't know which version you're preaching. Oh, and for the record, I directly want God to be true. Not only could I get the eternal reward, I'd also feel a lot less divided from my family, so I definitely don't have any problems about wanting it.
Wait, you claim to be an atheist, a beacon of reason. Never mind if atheism's true, reason doesn't exist. Because if atheism's true, if we're just molecules in motion, if we're nothing but moist robots, then we're not really reasoning anyway, we're just reacting.
I'm sorry, Frank, but that's an unfounded claim. The honest starting point is that you don't know whether molecules in motion can be capable of reason. If you want to claim that systems of these molecules either can or can't be capable of reason, you have to defend why. Here, like this. If molecules move according to random motion, if when they interact with each other the outcomes do not depend on the initial conditions, then they could not behave consistently. Since consistent outcomes are a necessary condition for something to reason, molecules in random motion could not produce reason. That's actually a point in your favor, Frank. I do need to finish the argument, though. The other side of the dichotomy is for molecules to move according to some set of rules, some pattern linking an initial condition to an outcome. In that case, some subset of the system could reflect another part. For example, when light falls on a retina, it sends a neural signal that corresponds to the image of the outside world. That subset could then be used in a simulator-like fashion to reason something out about the other part. I would expect molecules in motion to be capable of reason so long as there are patterns to their behavior rather than chaos. For example, in the real world, the neurons that make up our brains are more than capable of perceiving patterns in nature as sensory input and make logical, rational decisions based on that relevant information.
They don't want it to be true. They have a moral issue, an emotional issue. They have an accountability issue, maybe. In fact, let me tell you this, that most of the time on a college campus, evidence is not the issue. The elephant in the room is morality and accountability.
I have no more problem with the hypothetical existence of a moral God than I do an immoral God. Whether I would follow the God would depend greatly on which type it is, but whether the God exists is entirely unrelated to the God's morality. I am not an atheist because of a moral argument. Similarly, although I do have problems with the version of justice and accountability that any afterlife system possesses, it has no influence on whether or not I believe it to be true.
People don't want Christianity to be true. Why? Because they don't want there to be a God. They want to be God. They want to go their own way. They don't want to have a moral authority above them.
It's not about what I want, it's about the facts. And the fact is, my loss of my God belief didn't mean that I defaulted to seeing myself as God. To even suggest such a thing dilutes the concept of what God is. God is the creator of all, the source of all, the ultimate moral authority. I can barely create these videos, and all the hard work I put into understanding morality still only results in my puny subjective opinion. I'll also add that if Frank's particular Christian God exists, and really is the infinite good that he says it is, then I would become a Christian in a heartbeat. Too bad I think that God doesn't exist, and that the Bible is better used as a tool for establishing racism, misogyny, and fear than as a tool for preaching love. I will commend Frank for at least trying the latter option.
In fact, most people are not on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. Whatever's going to make them happy, they're going to believe. Now, this sword cuts both ways. Let's be honest. There's a lot of people that are just Christians because they think it makes them happy. And if you were to ask them, well, is there any evidence that Christianity is true? Do you have any evidence? They couldn't tell you. So the sword cuts both ways. But thankfully, I think you can believe something that's true even though you don't know it's true. And I think Christianity is true.
I agree. The sword does cut both ways. I have a very simple question for you, Frank. Does Christianity make you happy? If so, I'd love to hear some actual evidence. Otherwise, I think you might be falling into this very category of believing because you want to. I don't think you gave any evidence in this video, just two unfounded claims that atheists don't want to believe in God, and that the existence of reason itself is incompatible with atheism. Now, Frank does go on to derive one good point about how atheists must have stolen reason from God, but since that's based on the second of his unfounded claims, nothing actually stands. I won't show the rest of the video because I managed to get this far into it thinking it was his honest attempt to ask atheists a question, but actually he's just setting up a pitch for the book he's got behind him. He's clearly more interested in making money by paywalling his bad evidence than in actually presenting good evidence, so on to the next video. This one is called How is Life the Best Evidence Against Evolution?
L stands for limits to genetic change. For example, breeders know that they can't break the genus of, say, the canine. They can breed all sorts of dogs, as small as a Chihuahua, as large as a Great Dane, but they can't break that genetic limit.
You are correct in saying that the genus will never be broken, but only if you mean in a cladistic way. All descendants of dogs will forever be considered dogs. However, dogs of the distant future may look very different than their modern ancestors. Given a few tens of million years, or maybe less with artificial selection, the descendants of dogs could become dolphin-like or cow-like. They would always be genetically distinct from cows or dolphins or any other genus, even if subpopulations of dogs were forced to convergently evolve into forms similar to other animals. The most fundamental limit on evolution is the generational time, so if they are bred for long enough, there is no limits to how high the gradual changes can stack. Another way I can put this is that even though we have evolved to look and act very different from fish, we are still fish, at least cladistically speaking. Our tetrapod ancestors were themselves descended from a line of bony fish, and so we are fish. In the same way that we are now very unlike fish, the descendants of dogs could one day be nearly unrecognizable. Frank, I am begging you to understand how adaptive radiation works. Subpopulations of one species differentiate over time until they each become their own species, with all of them related as a genus defined by the original species. Each of the new species eventually speciates in turn, each one defining its own genus, and all species now are related as a family defined by the original ancestor. As time passes, each old species defines a new genus, each old genus defines a new family, each old family defines a new order, each old order defines a new class, and so on. To bring this back to Frank's original point, the only limit that would be experienced by the descendants of dogs is that they would never truly be able to eliminate all their dog-based vestigial organs. Many hundreds of millions of years from now, cladists will be able to find these shared vestiges among many species that look very different and use them to define the kingdom of dogs.
The I stands for irreducible complexity, which Michael Behe made famous back in a book from 1996 called Darwin's Black Box. In Darwin's day, he didn't know what was in the cell. Now we know the cell is just a blizzard of complexity that is so interconnected and complex that you can't modify one part without shutting down the whole cell.
Not only is that last bit Frank said another unfounded claim, it is demonstrably untrue. It is absolutely false to say that because it's complex and interconnected, any one change is likely to make the whole thing fall apart. On the contrary, the chaotic blizzard of interconnected biochemical pathways is a hallmark of an inefficient, undesigned evolutionary process. In such a system, it's actually very unlikely that any one change will cause a change that causes a change that causes a change that actually changes something of meaning to survival. More likely, a change causes a change which gets overruled and ignored by some other still functioning process. Most mutations are known to have marginal effects, with only a few mutations that are either drastically beneficial or crucially detrimental. Moreover, which mutations are which is determined almost entirely by what environment the organism finds itself in.
All the parts would need to be modified at the same time to have any function. It's irreducibly complex. And so it doesn't appear that gradualism works. And as Richard Dawkins famously said, if we don't have gradualism, we're back to a miracle.
Yet another unfounded claim. Why does gradualism fail? I hope Frank realizes that in such a complex and interconnected system, it's very difficult to prove a negative, to show definitively that there is not an evolutionary pathway between 2 points. If he wants to convince me that something is irreducible, he and Behe need to actually put the work into showing that it is not reducible.
The F stands for the fossil record. The fossil record does not comport with gradualism. The fossil record, particularly the Cambrian explosion, which apparently occurred about 538 million years ago, according to their dating, was an explosion of 20 out of the 28 major body plans, the phyla, appear in the geologic strata just fully formed with no fossil precursors. Even Dawkins says it looks like they were just placed there.
Firstly, to the point I was making earlier, it wasn't 20 new phylum that appeared in the Cambrian explosion. It was 20 new species at the time, and eventually the descendants of each group radiated so much that they constituted an entire phylum. Actually, it was probably many more than 20 new species, but only some fossilized and only some had descendants survive past the Cambrian. When science magazines talk about 20 new phylum, they're using shorthand. Furthermore, although we do have some fossils of the creatures from before the Cambrian, they are mostly trace fossils like impressions or burrows because the creatures were soft-bodied. But they were at a point in their evolution when armor plating and structural strength were selected for, and so many of the new body plans developed hard bits. These fossilized much better than what previously existed, and so they appear in the fossil records suddenly.
In other words, it comports better with a creation or intelligent design than it does a gradual process. If everything is ancestrally related and it went through all these transitionary forms, we should find millions of transitionary fossils, but we don't find them.
Sure, it fits with intelligent design theory. But since the designer of the universe can do miracles, everything fits because it's unfalsifiable. Frank, stop fitting everything you see into your theory that carries no predictions or explanatory power and sit down. It doesn't work better than evolution until evolution is demonstrated not to work. And the incomplete fossil record, really? I know you've buried your head in the sand, but that doesn't mean you can see all the underground fossils. Some things don't fossilize, and even when they do, they aren't always discovered by humans. Accept the fact that we have incomplete knowledge of the universe and deal with what we do know.
And the E stands for epigenetic information. Epigenetic information is the idea that you can't mutate DNA and get a new body plan. You have to have the structure change as well, and DNA doesn't change the structure.
Frank says that epigenetic information is the idea that you can't mutate DNA and get a new body plan. That definition isn't just unrelated to the actual concept, it is entirely false, because the majority of changes to any organism's body are due to mutations in the DNA. That was possibly the least accurate definition he could have given, so there really isn't a point I need to address. The part he mentioned about the structure is a bit better, but epigenetics is really more about which genes are on and off, and changes all the time. So this point really only supports the idea that Frank has no idea what he's talking about.
I just don't think macroevolution works. And even if it does work, the very laws that drive it require a mind to drive it. So you're not getting rid of God, even if macroevolution is true.
All agree that evolution does not falsify God, and it is consistent to believe that the laws of evolution were placed there by him. I actually grew up believing some form of deistic evolution, and learning more about evolution is not the reason why I lost faith. All that said, however, I have to disagree with Frank that the laws require a mind. My understanding of the underlying mutations is that they can't be anything other than random without a God, which is what we see. And the selective forces are entirely supplied by whatever the environment happens to be, an environment which the creature's parents found tolerable enough to at least reproduce. Neither of these requires a God. Since I think Frank has less debunked evolution and more demonstrated his lack of understanding of it, let's move on to the last video. This one is actually from the Daily Dose of Wisdom channel run by Brandon McGuire. I wanted to address Frank's surge argument, and since I couldn't find any videos on it from his own channel, this is the most concise version I could find.
S stands for the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is running down. As that sun is up there, it is burning out. Ultimately, we will go to heat death.
Correct, but imprecise. The second law says that the entropy of a closed system can never decrease. It must either increase or stay the same. This option to stay constant is what heat death refers to, a reaching of the maximum possible entropy and an inability to go back down. The universe doesn't just self-annihilate when it reaches the maximum, it just stops being possible for things to happen, and the future eternity of our universe becomes very, very boring. This doesn't just apply to the heat death of our universe. Any closed system can reach its maximum and then basically hold constant for all eternity.
Well, if the universe is eternal, that sun would have burned out a long time ago, but since the sun is still up there and we still have energy here, the universe must have had a beginning.
Nope, because again, the plateau. The conclusion of the second law should be that entropy has only been increasing for a finite amount of time. It doesn't mean that there is a finite amount of time. The infinite past could be spent at the minimum possible entropy in some metastable state, and the Big Bang is merely the event which marks the point at which entropy began increasing. There must be finite time between the Big Bang and now, but no such restriction for the period before the Big Bang. I've also made a video on the Big Bang, I'll link here, where I go through the evidence for it and what the term really means, so check that out.
The U in surge is the fact that the universe is expanding, discovered by Edwin Hubble in 1929. Hubble deduced that if the universe is expanding, if you watched everything in reverse, you would see it collapse back to a point, mathematically and logically to nothing. So the universe exploded into being out of nothing.
This is also a point I cover in my video, and again, Frank misunderstands the conclusion. We can conclude that everything converges as we wind back the clock, but at some point we reach a density that requires an understanding of quantum gravity, which we don't yet have. To say that there must be a singularity because the math says so, when the math is known to break down, is lunacy. Consider if you had a chance to watch the explosion from a block of C4, moving backwards in time, but you knew nothing about chemical energy or the ability to store energy in chemical bonds. It would be quite reasonable to assume, from the ideal gas law and the much lower pressure of the atmosphere surrounding the hot, dense, exploded gas, that the gas must get denser and hotter the further back in time one moves. But if you don't realize that this energy was supposed to go towards forming chemical bonds and turning the gas into a solid block of C4, you might think that this progresses to infinity and a singularity. My bet is that, in a similar fashion, there is a form energy can take under the quantum gravity regime, one which we do not yet know, but which could be the source of the Big Bang. In all that I know about the history of math and physics, no bet that a singularity in the model actually corresponded to one in reality has ever turned out correct. In math, singularities are a hallmark of incomplete understanding, not of knowledge.
The R stands for the radiation echo, discovered by accident by Penzias and Wilson, two scientists working at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey. They discovered basically the radiation afterglow, or the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. The heat is still out there. It's just a couple of degrees above absolute zero. Now, good theories predict future discoveries, and they said if the radiation afterglow is out there and the Big Bang really did occur, we ought to find very fine temperature variations among the radiation afterglow. So they sent up a satellite in 1989 to circle the Earth. It's called the Kobe Space Satellite, to measure this radiation afterglow. And for 3 years, they found nothing until they tuned their instruments just a little bit more precisely and found that there were temperature variations in the radiation afterglow, and they were down to 1 part in 100,000.
Frank does a good job with this segment, but I do want to be specific. The cosmic microwave background is not the afterglow of the Big Bang itself, nor is the Big Bang best described as an explosion. It was a stretching of space, allowing the matter contained to spread out and cool down. The CMB is the image of a universe about 380,000 years old after it had cooled enough for atoms to transition from ionized plasma to transparent gas. The microkelvin variations of the temperature are a specific prediction of inflation that have to do with the scale of the universe as it reaches thermal equilibrium, the details I'm not going to worry about in this video. But the important thing is that there is nothing in the CMB that should lead to the conclusion that the universe came from nothing. All it directly supports is that the universe cooled past the critical temperature of a plasma and that inflation happened.
The E in surge stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity, which says time, space, and matter are correlative. You can't have space without time. You can't have time without space and matter. And in effect, it says that the universe came into existence with space and time together. In other words, once there was no time, once there was no space, once there was no matter, and then bang, out of nothing, the universe exploded into being.
Einstein's general relativity is the description of the relation between space, time, and matter. Certainly the equation would break if one of the three pieces were missing, so I'll grant the codependence. But we can only trace the history of the universe back so far before relativity comes into conflict with quantum mechanics, and one or both of them must break down. General relativity is not applicable to the Big Bang itself, nor can it say anything about what came before. Frank is once again expressing his misunderstanding of math when he uses it to conclude that the universe came from nothing. Oh, and for those of you thinking I've skipped out on Serge's G, I didn't. Frank did. I was able to find it on his website. It stands for the galaxy seeds that he alluded to as coming from the variations in the CMB. While he is correct that this is generally evidence of the Big Bang, I have no idea how this supports the concept that the universe came out of nothing. All I'm sure of is that the acronym SURE would have been way better than SURGE, so he never needed it, but was still so incompetent that he entirely forgot to explain it. I want people to remember that Frank's doctorate is in theology, which means that whenever he talks about math and science, he's speaking outside of his field. He doesn't just lack authority on these subjects, he is a false authority because he speaks with confidence on topics despite repeatedly demonstrating that he doesn't understand them. There is not a single piece of evidence alluded to by Serge that shows that the universe came out of nothing. Any actual scientist would include an F in the Serge acronym, which would represent the first law of thermodynamics. It says that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. I wonder how Frank would squirm and dance in order to show that this law isn't contradictory to the idea that the universe was created. And just so we're all clear, energy is a mathematical property that can be assigned to any real system. If a universe exists, it must have some value of energy, and if nothing exists, then energy becomes an undefined concept.
The universe exploded into being, all space, all matter, all time, out of nothing. And several scientists have pointed this out. Stephen Hawking said almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang.
Having a beginning is not the same thing as coming from nothing.
He said astronomers now found they painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth, and they have found that all this has happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact.
Arguments from ignorance are not proven facts. Science is literally incapable of proving that supernatural forces exist. I'd appreciate it if he stopped quote mining and actually tried to make his own points, but who am I kidding?
So the cosmological argument leaves us with one question. Either no one created something out of nothing or someone created something out of nothing.
False. My position is that there was never nothing.
It is the argument from design, and there are dozens of factors about the universe that are precisely designed for the existence of the universe and life. So not only did the universe explode into being out of nothing, it did so with incredible precision.
I'll link to another video I made addressing the fine-tuning argument, so if you want a full response, be sure to check that out. The short response is that we don't know the probability that the various constants will take on life-permitting values. The numbers typically presented about how small the life-allowing range of each constant is simply aren't the same thing as the probabilities that the constants fall within said ranges. Frank goes on to quote a lot of big, scary numbers, but with no way to calculate the probabilities of the constants falling in the appropriate ranges, it's all meaningless. Until someone can produce a valid calculation of the probability that a universe has life-allowing constants, there is no fine-tuning argument. Ultimately, it's just an argument from ignorance.
There's also factors about our universe, in particular our solar system, that cannot be explained unless there's a designer behind it. For example, the Earth rotation, 24 hours, just right. If it was a little bit more, a little bit less, we wouldn't be here. The axial tilt, 23.5 degrees, just right. Change that a little bit, we're not here. The Jupiter being in its current orbit. If Jupiter wasn't there, we'd be bombarded with space material. Why? Because Jupiter acts as a cosmic vacuum cleaner. It attracts all the cosmic space junk to it rather than us.
Frank does nothing here to demonstrate the necessity of these conditions, nor calculate any of their probabilities.
Steven Weinberg, who is an atheist, put it this way: life as we know it would be impossible if any one of several physical quantities had slightly different values.
It's really hard to take Frank seriously when the quote he read says life as we know it, and he takes that to mean life in general. Life evolves to fit its niche. So if life evolved on some alien planet or under a different set of laws of physics, it would still exist, just not as we know it. Frank really needs to learn how to understand qualifications. There's a difference between the probability of human life forming and the probability of sentient life forming, which is a large part of why it's so difficult to figure out which constants would allow for life.
Life itself is designed. Let me take you to your breakfast table for just a second. Suppose you wanted to have a bowl of alphabet cereal. You're a teenager, and you come downstairs to have a bowl of alphabet cereal, and you see the alphabet cereal's knocked over, and the letters from the alphabet cereal are spelled out on the placemat, and it spells, "Take out the garbage, Mom." What are you going to assume? Cat knocked the box over? Earthquake shook the house? Or are you going to say, no, that's intelligent design from an intelligent being? Or let's say you're laying out on the beach and you see in the clouds, "Drink Coke." What are you going to assume? Unusual cloud formation? No, you're going to say there has to be a skywriter up there, even if you didn't see him. Why? Because messages only come from minds.
I've heard this argument from design so many times, and they always leave out the key part of the analogy. If alphabet soup were capable of breeding and producing offspring with traits inherited from their parents, and there was selection pressure to spell out English phrases, it would be entirely unremarkable to find such a message in a bowl of soup. If clouds could do the same, we would expect to see memos in the sky all the time. Messages written in English do imply an English speaker, and so no natural environment could ever form such selection pressures. However, it can evolve signaling systems given there are selective pressures to cooperate between a sender and receiver. The color of a flower can evolve to signal a bee, and ribosomes can evolve to translate sequences of RNA into proteins. There is no design at play, only unguided evolutionary processes.
From the goo to you via the zoo. From the infantile to the reptile to the crocodile to the gentile.
What's with the rhyming strawman? I'll give you the goo to you via the zoo one. That one's kind of funny and vaguely accurate. But gentiles did not evolve from crocodiles, which did evolve from reptiles, but which did not evolve from infantiles, which I don't even think have an evolutionary analogy.
That's the theory of macroevolution. The problem is that now we know that this intelligent life couldn't have come together by natural laws, because we now know that the simplest life has the amount of specified complexity or information in it in terms of DNA of 1,000 complete sets of Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah, and the entropy associated with this information is accounted for many, many times over. There's a very thorough video from Reason to Doubt I'll post in the description. They go through the second law of thermodynamics in detail, and the information contained in life is far from being in conflict with the available entropy from the sun.
Now, to believe that that resulted by natural law is like believing that the Library of Congress resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. See, I don't have enough faith to believe that.
I don't have enough faith to believe that either. I don't have any faith at all. I use evidence, and the evidence supports the idea of gradual evolution over countless generations. All of Frank's analogies fail to include the key feature of populations reproducing, instead reducing the formation of the information to a single chance event. I wonder if Frank will ever try to address my beliefs or only ever attack strawmen.
I just want to suggest the idea that it is not a matter of science or mathematics or logic that prevents people from believing in God. It is some predetermined a priori notion about what God is like and the fact that he is not the type of God who someone wants to worship.
No, it's science that prevents me from believing in a God. Based on my understanding of entropy in particular, I reject unexplained, uncaused sentience. Have a God who is omniscient and also the creator of the universe? Nope. Want to believe we spontaneously popped into existence last Thursday? I reject that. Any version of sentience, consciousness, agency, whatever you want to call it, must have come about through some process. It cannot be fundamental. I don't reject God because we don't get along. I reject him because I firmly believe that every instance of sentience must be contingent, and God isn't. If you ever want me to believe in God, you would need to break my understanding of physics. In fact, if I ever open one of the large bags of mini M&Ms I buy, I will take it as a message from God if the M&Ms are organized by color. If there is a name of a deity across the top in a different color than the background, I'll even believe in that God. I have a standard ready and waiting that I will consider miraculous if God ever wants to say hi to me.
So my plea to you watching this video, if you are finding yourself in the position of being an atheist or a seeker or a skeptic, is to go and look to Jesus. Look to the life of Jesus. Actually, just read the Gospel according to John if you haven't, and see if you find any error in his ways, or see if there is a ring of truth through the life of Jesus that reflects what we would expect to find from a perfectly good, loving, and powerful creator of the universe and of our species here on little old planet Earth.
I've read the book of John. I've read the whole Bible. My ears hear no ring of truth. Even if Jesus is a good person and a good role model, that does not make the supernatural claims of the Bible true. So that's it for Frank today. In summary, he doesn't understand atheism, he doesn't understand evolution, and he doesn't understand the Big Bang. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and of course, go read a fucking book.